Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lasseter here with you for another Fiveable review. Getting into some pretty fun content tonight with our study of China in the global Middle Ages. So we're going to be looking at that today. I do have a favor of you. If my audio seems to blink out, then just go ahead and put that in the chat. Let me know. We can do some troubleshooting. I had a couple issue with that about a month ago, but last time we were good to go. So we're hoping that will be the case tonight. A lot of fun stuff to talk about. Tonight, these are some of my favorite topics, looking at medieval China. I got real into this last year, so pretty psyched about doing it tonight. Let's go ahead and first talk about kind of what Fiveable has coming up soon. You'll find there's a call to action about signing up for one of our streams that we have tonight. Sorry, trying to find my words here as I pull up my speaker notes. And again, tonight we're talking about China in the global Middle Ages. So I'm going to shrink down. We're going to put that front and center. And just don't forget to follow Fiveable. You can find us on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, basically all over the place. So join, get in the know of what's happening around here. And speaking of being in the know, we have another stream for you tonight. Especially anybody out on the West Coast Central Time over here in the East Coast. I'm going to be in bed by it, but I'm definitely going to watch the replay with a Fiveable membership. So thinking thematically in AP World with Allie is tonight, 11 p.m. Central. That's midnight Eastern. Tomorrow, we have two great streams for you, Africa in the global Middle Ages and Southeast Asia in the global Middle Ages. You can see the theme we're working on as we're getting in past 1200 in this course. And then later this week, we have two more for you, Connections and Developments in the Americas and a live study group on the 22nd with Varun. So a lot of great stuff coming up with Allie, Charlie, Eric, who's here who joined in the chat to help me check out my sound, and provided some of the sources we're going to be looking at tonight. Then Evan and Varun later on this week. So a lot of really great stuff we have to look forward to. What are we going to be doing tonight? That's the big question. And you know, we got a lot to cover. So we're going to move quickly, but remember that you can always go back and rewatch the replays of these events. If there's anything that you miss or you feel like we went a little too fast for, then throw a question down in the Ask a Question section below. I'll be happy to go back and answer anything. One thing we thought about doing this week is looking at a few sources. So I have two kind of image sources that we're going to look at, and one written source that we'll have time for tonight. I'm going to try to sneak it in under that 1 hour, but y'all have done these with me before. That's a challenge sometimes. But tonight we're covering China just in a nutshell. I'm going to really just hit the high points of China before 1200. That's, some other videos. You can definitely look at some of the archives last year. We went into China in quite some depth. But we're focusing here on China basically from about 1200 to 1500. So the Song dynasty of China, which is in power at the beginning of this time period, followed by the Yuan dynasty. Those are the Mongols in China. And lastly, the Ming dynasty. And then we'll look at some similarities across the board, some trends in this time period. So trade and cross-cultural exchange and continuities. And then we'll look forward. I'll just kind of give you a couple things of what is upcoming in your studies of China. So let's go ahead and get to it. I know that's ambitious, but I think we can do it. So, if you're ready for this, just let me know. And if you have any questions along the way, again, stop me. Put a question in the chat. Really like to see some chatter there, or put questions down below. So let's get started just with kind of a basic overview, recap of China before 1200. So China is quite unique. And here I want to start by looking at some geography. And if you notice, if in the geography of China, it has two kind of very distinct regions that we think of as modern China. You have this mountainous territory out west, the Tibetan Plateau and desert to the west. But the eastern part of China is very arable. It is great rivers, lots of great soil for farming. This is going to be the region of China with the high population this is where we kind of tend to think of the center of Chinese civilization, beginning along the Yellow River, spreading south along the Yangtze. And China is sort of unique in that it has natural barriers on most sides. It has, desert and mountainous regions to the west and to the southwest, and to the east it has, of course, the ocean, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Pacific Ocean. But there is one region that's not well protected, and that is the north. And so the northern steppe lands of China are always going to be kind of a continuity of a place that is very difficult for China to defend over the course of its history. So we just want to keep that in mind, that if we look at the geography, we can predict quite a bit about this state or this empire throughout history. Densely populated east, relying on agriculture, generally protected from outside threats, except to the north. So that'll play a role when we start talking about the Mongols, of course. So let's talk just first about early developments. China, of course, thousands of years ago, one of the first civilizations to develop farming. Rapid development, goes through a couple time periods that you may have heard about or may have gone over with your teacher if you did a Unit 0. That is the Shang period of China, kind of the earliest period of organization where we see the earliest villages and farming and the earliest writing in China. Then the Zhou period, which was where we have the Zhou dynasty in charge. However, and they have claimed the mandate of heaven, but it really operates more so as a feudal system. China doesn't have a really united central government. And eventually the Zhou dynasty falls, and China breaks into what we call the Warring States period. And during that Warring States period, we have really three different philosophies begin to develop in China. Those are Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism, and we'll talk about those momentarily. But the Warring States period goes on for hundreds of years until it is finally ended by the leader of the dynasty that you see pictured here, Qin Shi Huangdi. And Qin Shi Huangdi is a legendary figure, lives in the 200s BCE, and he unifies China, standardizes weights and measures, creates but rules with a very strict hand, very what we call legalistic, and I'll talk about that momentarily. But he's the only ruler of that dynasty. When he dies, it crumbles very soon after, and it's followed by the Han dynasty. And then we get this kind of dynastic cycle in China, where you have the rise of a dynasty. In the absence or in the following the downfall, they claim the mandate of heaven. They not only build up government, but they also have new innovations to improve that government. The Han dynasty built a wonderful bureaucracy, and once they fell, that bureaucracy was later reconstituted under the Sui and the Tang dynasties of China, as well as under some of the dynasties we'll talk about today. And so we see this dynastic cycle. And if you may have heard the song, it's Shangzhou, Qin Han, Sui Tang Song. And the song is where we start in our presentation today. Now, when we think about philosophy and belief systems in China, it really comes out of that Warring States period that there are kind of three ways to answer the same question. How does one create order in society when there is none? And the legalists, not pictured, previously pictured under with Qin Shi Huangdi, The legalists answered that with, people are evil, that's why there's chaos, you need a strict government who has harsh punishments, and people will get in line. And that worked for a time, but it also bred a great deal of resentment. On the other end, you had a group of people, Taoists, who said, things become chaotic when we interfere, when we interfere with nature or the way or the Tao. In that sense, we should better understand nature and we should better understand how we fit in that and not try to direct ourselves too much, because that's where chaos comes from. Perhaps somewhere in the middle of that spectrum is Confucianism. And that is going to be the most important philosophy that comes out of China, certainly out of the Warring States period. And will basically be the thing that directs China for the future. And it'll be present in the Song dynasty as well. So this Confucian philosophy, founded by Confucius and then later expanded upon by other scholars and students of his, said that the way to create order was by building good relationships. And he came out with, he described 5 key relationships: father to son, husband to wife, elder to younger, ruler to subject, and friend to friend. And it was all about the superior. In the case, it was a very patriarchal system. So let's say the husband had to take care of the inferior, the wife, or the father to the son, or the ruler to the subject. And in exchange, the inferior there responded with respect and reverence and obedience. And already in this chat, we got Alexandra with chiming in with what my question was going to be, which is this, what is the word for this? And it's summarized best as filial piety. And so that was what Confucianism was all about. It said, we have these relationships, and if we can carry out these relationships, then we will have a society that works. How do you create good people who know how to, who follow this format? Well, you educate them. And so education also became a major part of the Chinese cultural fabric. And it will continue to be so in dynasty after dynasty. So that's a little bit of background before 1200. And I really wanted to end with Confucianism because in the Song dynasty, Confucianism, like it did in many other dynasties prior, was very important to that society. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this Song dynasty. It was an age, as I have it here called, an age of innovation. Now, if we think about this dynasty itself, the Song dynasty comes about in like the year 960, I think is the starting date for it. And it continues a lot of the successes of previous eras of China. For example, it continues to implement a Confucian bureaucracy, which meant that Confucian scholars would take a test, the civil service exam, to take a role in government. And that made sure that there was this educated class leading China underneath the emperor. And of course, having a bureaucracy allowed that power to be centralized. And so we have this Confucianism playing a role, a bureaucracy. Another thing that's a continuity with earlier eras, that China maintains being a patriarchy. So it is a patriarchal society. One of the examples of this in Song Dynasty is foot binding, which occurs where women bind their feet as a show, oftentimes of wealth and the fact they don't have to work. But it was also an example of kind of extreme patriarchy, as women were subjected to that, but men were not. And the Song dynasty also claims what is called the mandate of heaven, this idea that heaven above has chosen this dynasty to lead China. But what else do you need to know about the Song dynasty? They last just kind of over the line for this time period. They last until the year 1279, when they're defeated by the Mongols. But in that time between approximately 960 and 1280, it was a great period of innovation. It was a highly urbanized society, very cosmopolitan. It was a society that produced a great deal of art and new inventions. It used paper money. It continued the use of gunpowder. And of course, it developed even some new institutions for China in terms of, I lost my train of thought there. What was I thinking? In terms of implementing Neo-Confucianism, which played a major part in the government, this reemergence of Confucianism after, in the Tang Dynasty, it had kind of fallen back in prominence in favor of for example, Buddhism and Taoism. Song China is oftentimes referred to as a proto-industrial empire, and what that means is it wasn't quite industrial. It had not reached an industrial revolution, but some historians and some of the stuff that you might get to read in your AP courses like to bring up that maybe China was on the cusp of that. For example, they were using coal and coke in their furnaces to forge better metals. And so in that sense, China may have been onto something, especially during this time period. Other things that we see are advancements in steel, and those advancements in steel and iron production, textiles for export, and the like. So the Song Dynasty has a great number of those innovations. Now, if we think about the effects of innovation in the Song Dynasty, which I've lost in my notes where I put that, here we go. So when we think about the effects of innovation in the Song Dynasty, what we end up seeing certainly is increased productive capacity, right? China is going to be able to certainly produce more. And that's going to allow them to expand trade networks and to produce greater innovations in agriculture and manufacturing. And so what we see there is, this is going to, certainly if you're producing more food, for example, you're going to see population explosions in China. But the economy of Song China, because of this age of innovation, certainly flourishes for a time. Eventually, of course, it will be dealing with some problems that are difficult to overcome. Question in the chat here about the three-field system. Did that contribute to their agricultural prosperity? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if the three-field system is in the Song Dynasty. So you may want to check on that. Off the top of my head, I can't remember it, and I can look that up a little bit later, and we can go back to that question. But the three-field system certainly does contribute to agricultural prosperity as they start this kind of system of planting something in one field, something else in another, and then allowing fields to rest. And I want to give y'all an answer right now, so I'm sorry for the short delay on this, but I'm going to see if that's the Song Dynasty, if that's a previous dynasty. Let me see real quick. Just got to go to a textbook. Always keep my textbook handy, as you should. You presumably have one handy at your in your thing, in your course. I can't find it here. I'll have to look that up later and get back to you. I may have to put the answer in. Take a look at it at the end. Let's see. Eric popping in. Mr. Beckman, cycling nitrogen and phosphorus from human and animal waste into wet rice agriculture boosted productivity in East and Southeast Asia. And that is why we are a team here at Fiveable. We're coming in with strong with the answer. So what we see is that idea of fertilizing your agriculture, boosting productivity, and thus creating Well, you get more food, you get more people, then you get more economic productivity. Man, lifesaver on that one. So let's talk a little bit about the fall of Song China, just so we can get into this into the Yuan dynasty and keep moving on. I do have a quick source after this, though. Song China, their biggest problem. Remember how I mentioned geography at the beginning and how that was difficult to protect the north. The Song spent a lot of money trying to protect the northern parts of their dynasty, of their empire, from outside invaders, and that had happened for many years. In fact, we break the Song period into two different eras: what we call the Northern Song, when the capital was in the northern part of the country, and then the Southern Song, which was actually the map I showed you later on, with the capital moved further to the south. As they could not keep those outside forces from invading. You see the Jin Empire there. So the Song dynasty continues to deal with this. They eventually retreat somewhat, and still are spending massive amounts of money defending their land. Ultimately, they struggle for defense against a new and growing empire, and that is the empire of the Mongols. Eventually, Kublai Khan, not Genghis Khan, but Kublai Khan, ends up being the one to conquer the Southern Song in 1279. And so that's going to bring an official end to Song Dynasty China. Now, I do want to talk about Song Dynasty China and that idea of Confucianism. And so I just have a piece of art that I want to look at that gets at this idea, though I think Alexandra was a little bit ahead of me on this, of thinking about filial piety and the Song Dynasty. And the reason I want to show this image is really twofold. We want to kind of analyze this a little bit, but we also want to see some examples of art that you might see in your course. And so in this image that we have, this is illustrations that were for the classic of filial piety, and this is just a detail of it. So it's zoomed in somewhat. And what we have here are a patriarch and a matriarch of a family sitting on this elevated platform, being served by those around them, and their servants or children are there kind of paying them respect. And so we have this kind of traditional image, and this is an illustration that comes from the Song Dynasty era, demonstrating this important Confucian concept of filial piety. So that's something that, just take a look at it, take it in, and see kind of how this is showing it, right? We have the patriarch of the family here. So if we think about the relationships at play here, we have husband to wife, father to son, and the idea is being benevolent, taking care of those who are lower than you, but also the others being obedient. And then we have here as an example, someone bowing or kneeling at their feet as they serve them, as a sign of obedience and respect. So keep these images in mind, and also look at kind of the style of artwork we have here, how it's shown, and keep that in mind when we look at an image a little bit later on from the Yuan dynasty. And I want to think about perhaps why the second image we're going to see is depicted as it is. All right. So let's see what we have. Looking at the chat, we have some good information here about and I forgot to mention this, actually. I do have this somewhere in my notes. One of the things that we see in China that produces agriculture, or that increases agricultural production, is the introduction of champa rice into China. And I believe that comes in perhaps in the Tang dynasty a little bit earlier. But that fast ripening champa rice still continued to be a big booster of production, agricultural production in China. Champa rice was fast ripening, as Mr. Beckman says there, but it could be harvested multiple times a year, and so that was something that definitely increased agricultural productivity. All right, moving on. Let's take a look next at our Yuan dynasty. So the Yuan dynasty is the name that we give to our Mongol dynasty. The Mongol Empire rises quite very rapidly under Genghis Khan, and this isn't a video on the Mongols, so I know we love them, but they end up conquering basically the entirety of Asia, nearly the entirety of Asia, with South Asia and Southeast Asia notwithstanding, and Japan gets away. But you can see their extent on the map here. The Mongol Empire eventually kind of splinters into 4 major khanates. And one of them, the Khanate of the Great Khan, was led by a guy named Kublai Khan. And he eventually conquers the Song dynasty of China. And what ends up happening then is that you have, for the first time in China's history, but not the last, mind you, but for the first time in Chinese history, you have a foreign group ruling over China. So no longer are the Chinese ruling their own country. Instead, they are being subjected to the Yuan Empire. So Kublai Khan establishes this empire in China in 1279. It's going to last until about 1368, so just under 100 years, but still pretty impactful overall. Under the Yuan dynasty, there were a great number of changes. For example, the Chinese, the ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese, were largely excluded from the government. There was oh gosh, losing my train of thought. The Yuan dynasty, though, does continue some aspects of the Chinese bureaucracy while getting rid of others, like putting a pause on the civil service exam. So when the Mongols are in charge, though, there are a lot of went too far. There are a lot of different effects. For example, the Pax Mongolica, which united all the regions of the Mongol Empire from the Middle East all the way to China, was a period of intense Silk Road trade. And of course, China, being on one end of this Silk Road trade, benefits mightily from it, right? Because they're trading along these routes. During the Mongol rule, there's also a transfer of knowledge which continues, especially of math, astronomy, geography, knowledge of printing. The use of gunpowder spreads from China to the rest of the world, and that transfer of knowledge comes back as well. I think one of my favorite images, I didn't pull it in here, was that Kublai Khan, or I believe it was Kublai Khan, perhaps one of his successors, I think it was him, has an observatory built in China, and it's in the style of observatories built in the Middle East, because they bring in a lot of people from the Middle East to help govern. So that there's a transfer of knowledge and transfer of people. There's also a transfer of foods, pepper, cinnamon, tea, moving back and forth along these Silk Roads through the Mongol Empire. Certainly another change that we see is a change in the official social hierarchy of China. So the Confucian hierarchy of China, at least in practice, valued the educated bureaucracy above all, right? That was the group that helped keep China running. It was an educated class, and below them was the farmer, right? The peasant farmer. And at the bottom of this kind of Confucian bureaucracy was actually, and this is kind of throughout most of Chinese history, was the merchant, which was very different than a society like in the Middle East, where merchants were seen very highly because of its connection with Islam. So Under the Mongols, well, they valued trade a great deal. So they actually elevate merchants higher than the level of peasant farmers. Now, does that mean peasant farmers used to be rich and now they are no longer rich? No, but more so as a symbolic change. The Mongols were showing that they valued trade above the traditional Confucian system. The Mongols, though, were overall initially tolerant of a lot of things, although they did not allow the Chinese to participate in government, and they dismantled the civil service system. But they did preside over an early period of prosperity. When that prosperity eventually comes to an end, they are overthrown by a rebellion, what's called the Red Turban Rebellion. And eventually, after about 90 years in power, the Yuan dynasty comes to an end. I want to think about this Yuan dynasty and the idea, though, of these foreign rulers ruling over China. And the guy you still see on the screen here, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan dealt with a number of things. One, he was wanting to rule over China, and in doing so, he needed to keep certain Chinese institutions. But at the same time, there was, of course, that caused some problems among the Mongols themselves, who viewed the Chinese way of life as almost anti-Mongol. Right? They're settled down. They are living in these large cities, and the Mongols are pastoral people. They move from place to place, and they hunt, and they can live temporarily from place to place, moving quickly and fighting wars, and that's what Kublai Khan wasn't seeming to do. And so that was something kind of that he's kind of caught in the middle. But I want to take a look at this piece of artwork for a moment, because I think it is pretty interesting. I think this might have been on one of the AP exams from years back. But we have here Kublai Khan hunting. So this is a painting from the year 1280. So right after Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire conquers China. And it shows a couple of things here. So for those of you in the chat, if you can identify anything in this image, go ahead and throw it up in the chat. What do you think this image says about what Kublai Khan wanted to show about his empire? What did he find important about what his empire was about, or what his way of life or the Mongol rule was all about? So think about that, and again, just enter it in the chat. Don't worry. Take a stab in the dark if you're not 100% sure. But look closely at the image. We have some detail there. The insets give a little bit more detail. What does it say about Mongol life? And what does it say about their connection to China? Ooh, Leah in first with horses. You got that right. Mongols, a pastoral horse people. All right. So one thing that we have here is they're not just hunting, walking around. They are hunting on horseback. And of course, the Mongols and their horses were of course famous, as they were seen as the best riders, and had really bonded with their horses. There's great stories of Mongols going on long rides and even cutting the nape of a horse's neck to suck the blood out if they weren't drinking. Bows and arrows, yes. So they're hunting with traditional Mongol weapons, right? We're not seeing here them hunting with anything particularly Chinese. But we also see in the background this idea. Some of the coats are worn to show power and intimidate their enemies. Okay, so we see with Kublai Khan in this image, right? He is dressed quite elaborately. Ellie in the chat, traveling long distances. Yeah, that's what I wanted to show. Look in the background here. We kind of got this steppe land, and if you look in the back, and this is the detail of it up at the top right, we see camels wandering. So what do we think that, thinking about camels traveling long distances, what do we think that is a symbolic of? What is that supposed to represent, do we think? So go ahead and just put it in the chat if you got some ideas. And I know that there's a little bit of a lag, so I'll give you a moment. So Lucia, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Lucia, has come in with the, putting the question mark at the end, but I don't think you don't need the question mark. So we have this idea of trade, right? Camels were a common beast of burden on long trade routes, especially in along the Silk Roads. So here we have kind of an allusion to the Silk Roads trade, not only trade stability under the Mongols with the Pax Mongolica, but also a explosion of trade, right? This growth of trade in China. Pay attention also, right? All these things are showing perhaps things that the Mongols did. Ilsa, pop it in. Great job. Growth of trade, nailed it. So we see here things that the Mongols did, right? They're on horseback, they're hunting, right? These great Mongol traditions. But oh yeah, Kublai Khan, who's at the center of this, not only is he keeping his Mongol traditions, but also look at all this great trade that's going on in China. Now we also have to understand that at this time he had just conquered China. And if we look at the style of artwork we have here, the style of artwork is ink, or the media is ink and colors on silk. And it's painted by a Chinese artist. So this is not a Mongol artist painting this. This is a Chinese artist, and it's being painted on silk, right? Silk was one of the greatest exports of China, and especially in the Song dynasty. So here's a Mongol ruler, but being painted in a very Chinese style. In fact, if we go back to the previous image, if I can get it up on the thing here, here we have Kublai Khan painted in the style of Chinese emperors, again being painted on silk. So this image is kind of an interesting blending of not just this idea of Mongol, what it means to be a Mongol, but also of what the Mongols bring with them, right? Success, prosperity, trade, as well as what society the Mongols are starting to integrate with right here, having this Chinese style of art. So a lot that we can gain from these images. One of the reasons why I showed you the image earlier was not just to drive home the point of filial piety and Confucianism, but also because the style of art is also pretty similar. And you can see that in kind of all three of those images. So that's something we want to think of. Ellie, I see that you got in there. Good job. So Alexandra has a question here. Did the Mongols just want to take over and steal their cultural customs, but continue practicing Chinese traditions? Almost the other way around. They wanted to continue practicing some of their own traditions, but they did want to continue some Chinese practices in helping, especially to administer this new Yuan empire. So the Yuan dynasty definitely, even though it was primarily, even though they, from the highest levels of the Chinese bureaucracy or the Yuan bureaucracy, they banned ethnic Chinese, there still were prominent members of the Chinese bureaucracy, and the system itself, the bureaucratic system in order to govern China, was kept relatively largely in place, although the civil service system was dismantled for a time. And presumably in your classes, or hopefully in your classes, you'll read a little bit more about this. There is that quite a bit about Kublai Khan out there to be read, about Kublai Khan's admiration for Chinese culture while also still maintaining some of those Mongol traditions. So pretty fascinating time period. There is a question that Lucia has asked. Was the Pax Mongolica due to a lot of Asia being dead due to Mongol slaughter? Well, I bet my guess would be that the people who were slaughtered might think of it that way. But really and truly, and again, this may get kind of too much into a video on the Mongols. That would be helpful. The Pax Mongolica is more so due to the Mongols creating an empire that valued trade and protected traders and merchants. The Mongols, for example, issued passports to traders and merchants, and the passports would, for example, say, woe is he, I don't know the language exactly, who messes with someone who has this passport, because we have made it very clear that you can't touch them. They are protected by the Great Khan. The end. Something along those lines. But they issue these passports to traders and merchants, and it spurs on trade. In addition to that, they just lower barriers to trade by uniting this region and as a single empire, protecting the major trade routes to make sure that trade was continuing. Also, because one empire had connected everything from the Middle East, right, where there's a great deal of demand for goods and trade and knowledge, with China, this other great region that has a great supply of goods and knowledge, right? Finally, they're connected, and the Silk Roads are going to be the things that really connects it. So it's not necessarily everybody's dead, but that once the Mongols kill everyone, they institute a system that protects and promotes trade. And of course, China gets to be on one end of that. Now, the Mongols eventually do fall. Don't want to forget that, right? They're only in charge for roughly 90 years, 89 years or so. And eventually, after that Red Turban Rebellion, the Mongols are forced out. And under the Ming Dynasty, the third of these dynasties, China returns to Chinese rule. The Ming Dynasty comes to power in the year 1368, which is the year the Yuan Dynasty falls, and they are going to rule China well past the end of the time period I'm covering in this lecture, until the year 1644. And this is a restoration of, under the Ming, there's a restoration of Chinese institutions, as you would assume with the return to Chinese rule. For example, there's a revival of Confucianism. We see Neo-Confucianism in China again, taking a prominent role where it had taken kind of a backseat under the Mongols, who did not value Confucianism. For example, they rolled back Mongol changes, such as the social hierarchy that I talked about. I remember how I said that merchants were elevated above peasants. Well, the Ming Dynasty corrects that, and they put peasant farmers back where they believe they should be. The Ming Dynasty did rule over a period, or they did have a period of stability and a great deal of trade, especially in the early years of the Ming Dynasty. But as we get close to the year 1450, 1500, they are going to cut back a great deal and self-impose isolation. But during this period of stability and trade and prosperity, the Ming have a prolific period of art and literature. For example, Ming porcelain is produced during this time, so you may recognize some of these vases. The traditional blue and white porcelain, which becomes, once Europeans arrive, is in extremely high demand in Europe until they learn to make cheap knockoffs. But that's neither here nor there. Thanks a lot to the Dutch for that. So there is this art and literature, Ming porcelain. As far as literature goes, one of the earliest known novels ever written, Journey to the West, comes out of this time period too. A couple other things that I kind of jumped past because I got a little excited there about art and literature. In restoring Chinese institutions, not only did Confucianism take a major role in that social hierarchy corrected, but we also see civil service exams reinstated in China, right? Those were the exams that tested people on their Confucian knowledge. And if you passed them, you got a job in the bureaucracy of China. People would study for years and years and years just to take those exams. The Ming Dynasty, of course, knowing that the Mongols had been pushed back, they restore and then expand the Great Wall of China. because you got to protect from the nomadic peoples to the north. Again, the one really unprotected area of China. And the Ming will continue to, as I said, go through this prosperity and era of trade. And one way they seek to do that is through sending out voyages. So thinking about their own expansion. And in doing so, they send out an admiral with treasure ships and a massive fleet, a guy named Zheng Ha. And this is kind of one of the more, I would say, one of the better examples of a Chinese dynasty really trying to expand its influence in the maritime world. Zheng Ha goes out with a treasure fleet, thousands of ships. He has like a lot of large ships, and then like I think maybe hundreds. I forget the number, but you're not going to be asked that on the AP exam. Sends out these ships with these support ships to go and establish tributary states throughout Southeast Asia and even into the Indian Ocean. The goal is to make connections with some diasporic communities, some of these communities of Chinese merchants who had been kind of spread around Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean, that had really gone into those areas when the Mongols had taken power, and make some of those connections. He also, during the reign of Yongle, who was the emperor, the Ming emperor at the time, wanted to establish tributary states. So show the power of China and that the Ming dynasty was there to stay and there to be quite powerful, and thus gain tribute from these regions to bring back to the emperor. Zheng Ha's journeys, I don't know if I have a map of these. I think I forgot to put a map in here of Zheng Ha's journeys. Yep, sorry guys. His journeys went all over Southeast Asia, into the Indian Ocean, and even into the Middle East, we believe. And in doing so, he also brought back great gifts and tribute from other regions of the world. From Bengal in South Asia, he even brought back a giraffe, I think a couple of giraffes for the emperor. And so the Ming dynasty was trying to expand their presence. However, the voyages of Zheng Ha were quite expensive, paying for these fleets, thousands of people going out and trying to spread the influence of China just wasn't lucrative enough. They were not coming back and bringing back as many as many riches and as many connections as some in the Ming court wanted. They were costly. One thing also, Zheng Ha was a Muslim eunuch, so he was not what's seen as kind of a Confucian scholar that a lot of people in the Ming dynasty would have liked. And so a lot of people were very skeptical of the imperial advisors to the Emperor Yongle, and as being perhaps not having the best interests in China at heart. And then when Yongle dies, there's a change in emperor, and when that happens, there's often changes in policies. And so these connections that China had made, and really to establish themselves as a major player, especially in the Indian Ocean, let alone Southeast Asia, and East Asia, where they already were, they established themselves and then they self-impose isolation. They simply decide that it's not worth the cost. And this happens, right around the mid 1400s. And not long after, 40, 50 years later, who comes into the Indian Ocean and wants to establish some trading posts and trading post empires, but the Portuguese. And so just in kind of this matter of happenstance, coincidence, China withdraws from the Indian Ocean and self-imposes isolation in order to concentrate more so on Chinese institutions, just as the Europeans are entering it. That's a great what if in history. So if we think about, perhaps why did they pull back, just thinking or going through it one more time, we have the idea that these voyages were quite costly and were costing the Chinese government quite a lot, money that could perhaps be used in other ways, like protecting the borders. There was skepticism of the imperial advisors to Yonglao, who were very, we had a lot of his advisors were believed that they should pull back from these voyages. Many were pushing for them. And so there was some skepticism there in their success. And then, of course, when the emperor changes, there is also that. So China pulls back, not completely from trade. China is still going to be trading. Certainly, they will be trading with some people through in the maritime system, and they will still trade along the Silk Road. So not completely out of the game, but it very well could have gone differently if they continued those voyages. I have another source here, one more source to look at today, but this is a written source, and it is related to Zheng He and his voyages. This is the inscription on a stele at the Temple of the Celestial Spouse, which he is asked by the emperor to rebuild. And so they go on and they build this temple. And he erects this stele before his final journey in 1431. So what I want to do is, as we read through this source, I want us to simply think about what is being shown here, right? So what are the reasons for these voyages? What does Zheng He see as the reasons for these voyages? And what are his goals for these voyages? And how perhaps does that relate to some of the themes that we've seen tonight? So this is from Zheng He's inscription. Whenever you look at a source, always look at that source information first. If you get to a question on a test, you want to look at the sourcing information first before you read the source. Then you want to look at the multiple choice questions. I didn't write any for you tonight, so don't get too nervous. Look at those questions, see what you're reading for. So let's, as we read this, try to see, what he saw as important, perhaps what he saw as the reason for these voyages. So it reads, "The emperor, approving of their loyalty and sincerity, has ordered us, Zheng He and others, at the head of several tens of thousands of officers and flag troops, to ascend more than 100 large ships, to go and confer presence on them, in order to make manifest the transforming power of the imperial virtue, and to treat distant people with kindness." So here in this first paragraph already, we're seeing that this is a command. He sees this as a command of the emperor to go out and give gifts to others, which presumably would be reciprocated, as they understand that China giving these wonderful gifts is a powerful force, and to treat distant people with kindness. Now, it might become a little bit more clear as we go why that might be important for an emperor to treat people with kindness. But if you have some ideas, go ahead and throw it up in the chat, and we'll look at what you say when we're done reading. "Truly, this was due to the majesty and the good fortune of the court, and moreover, we owe it to the protecting virtue of the divine celestial spouse." Remember, this is being erected at the Temple of the Celestial Spouse. "When we arrived in the distant countries, we captured alive those of the native kings who were not respectful, and exterminated those barbarian robbers who were engaged in piracy, so that consequently the sea route was cleansed and pacified, and the natives put their trust in it. All this due to the favors of the goddess, celestial spouse." So here we have a few things at work, right? This idea that they have good fortune, they are being protected by this divine spirit, but also a little bit of what they are trying to do, right? They're trying to make sure to get rid of piracy, to encourage trade, right? Those that were not respectful to the Chinese, those native kings, as he says, who were not respectful, they capture those alive, and then they exterminate the pirates, basically, right? Trying to make sure to clean up the waters, and then to ensure that the people in these lands are respectful of China. commanding the multitudes on the fleet and being responsible for a quantity of money and valuables in the face of violence of the winds and the nights, our one fear is not to be able to succeed. How should we then dare not to serve our dynasty with exertion of all our loyalty and the gods with utmost sincerity? So, we have this reading. We see some of his motivations here as well. So there is kind of an underlying theme that we've been talking about throughout this course or throughout this slideshow tonight. See if what are we seeing here? What is it? So put it in the chat if you think, what is the theme that we see in this document and how that might relate to some of the earlier documents that we saw. So one thing that I see in this, and you might be putting it in the chat here as we catch up on the delay, is that it talks about being loyal and sincere to the emperor and being obedient to the emperor, right? Those who were not respectful to the Chinese emperor, to the Chinese coming to their region, they were captured. They were punished, in a sense. This, of course, even wanting to serve our dynasty, and Alexander's got it here. That idea of filial piety. Subject and loyal to a superior. And Lucia has here this idea that we have some mixing of cultural information here. So that's beyond what we're doing in this presentation, but you're hitting on something for sure. The fact that we have some perhaps syncretic practices here, some syncretic beliefs kind of showing up. Again, I don't want to get too into that because that's another rabbit hole that we certainly don't have time for. But we do see here kind of this return to this idea of filial piety, Confucianism, right? What would be at this point Neo-Confucianism, right? This renewed emphasis in Confucianism. And Zheng He is important, right? In the spread of this Neo-Confucianism. This Neo-Confucianism moves from China to Korea and Japan. It moves into Southeast Asia. It's part of this process of sinification that goes on here. But we see that kind of underpinning this document. And remember what we said, the Ming Dynasty, or how we framed it here, was a return to Chinese rule, right? So we're seeing, that there's that brief period where perhaps Confucianism not front and center, but again, once we move past it, we move to Chinese rule, and the Ming Dynasty keeps or returns it to front and center. And it's even seen in this stele. I think that theme definitely underpins it. Of course, there's a lot more on that, and you can look it up if you'd like. I'll put it up here again. It's the Zheng He's inscription at Chungla. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Hopefully, I've never heard it pronounced, so doing my best. So just something to think about with the sources and the themes that we're seeing throughout the sources today, right? We can identify similarities between them. We can also identify some differences. All right. So thinking about what we were just talking about, the spread of those cultural traditions, right? Under the Ming, well, beginning with the Mongols, right? We had a lot of trade and the spread of knowledge from one end of the Silk Roads to the other. Under the Ming, we see similar things. We continue to see the spread of cultural traditions. This idea of Neo-Confucianism spreading to Korea, Japan, spreading into Southeast Asia. These Chinese cultural traditions certainly influence these neighboring regions. And there are some examples of this is the idea of filial piety that comes out of Neo-Confucianism in East Asia. the influence of Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism from China in East Asia. And then the certainly in the literary traditions and the scholarly traditions of Japan and Korea, Chinese literature and Chinese education influences those regions as well. And so that is seen as, especially in the early years of this time period, 1200, 1500, China is quite powerful. And the Song dynasty has influences over these regions, but also the Ming as they go out. So just kind of keep some of those things in mind, that there are the spread of these Chinese cultural traditions. Went too far. Certainly, there are Mongol influences that help spread these traditions or spread trade, ideas, cross-cultural exchange, right? As in the Yuan dynasty allowed for trade along the Silk Roads. And this is kind of one of the big themes that we see. Oftentimes you might get a source, and it might not necessarily be Chinese in origin itself, but it could be a Korean source or a Japanese source, but it might have themes of Buddhism or Confucianism or some combination thereof, and it might ask about influences, and you would want to look toward China for those influences for sure. And make sure I'm not missing anything here before we move on. Last thing is to think about continuities in this era. And we're already kind of thinking about it by looking at some of our artwork here. And in this image, you actually see some of the ships of Zheng He's fleet with their large bamboo sails. These ships dwarfed European caravels. I know I didn't pull the image in for this, but there's if you search caravel and Zheng He, you can find on a Google image search some artistic comparisons of the size of these ships, and they just absolutely were massive. When the Europeans arrive in South Asia in their tiny little ships, I mean, they come up with like these, these textiles that just pale in quality compared to the Chinese silk and the riches that were brought from China in the voyages of Zheng He, and they basically just get laughed at. However, because of the spread of another technology, that is gunpowder, the caravels ended up being quite formidable because they had cannons on board. So let's think about continuities across this era, across this kind of era of medieval China. Again, the Ming dynasty, by the way, I want to say, doesn't fall until 1644. So it's going to continue to be important. But there are these techniques of imperial administration, especially the use of a bureaucracy, especially Confucian bureaucracy, that are continuities across most of the era. The Chinese civil service exam is used by the Song and the Ming with a brief interruption under the Yuan dynasty. But you might say, well, between the Song and the Ming, it is a continuity. If we're thinking in terms of those governmental, imperial administrative continuities. The Silk Roads, maritime trade, those are some continuities that we see across the era. Trade continues to be important in China. The maritime trade coming to an end sort of right there, at the end. So, what can you do? But ultimately, right, in the Silk Roads, we're going to see, in general, high value to low weight ratio goods being traded along the Silk Roads throughout this time period. The silk, spices, precious metals, gems and jewels, anything that is high value, high dollar to low weight ratios. Those were commonly traded along the Silk Roads. And the maritime trade did have those things like spices and silk, but it also dealt in heavier items because obviously you could carry more of those on ships. Beyond that, cultural continuities in medieval China. We've talked Confucianism nearly to death here, but we haven't really talked a whole lot about Buddhism, which does have a place in China, Taoism, which has a place in China, and they continue throughout this time period as well. In fact, Buddhist practices continue to spread into the outlying regions of Southeast and East Asia from China, kind of flowing through China and out to these other regions. So we don't want to forget those either. So that's something to keep in mind. That is still happening in this time period. Now, our last thing, and then I'll answer any questions you have for a little bit. I know I've gone over time, and I kind of expected that, but because there's just so much to cover here, and I like having a lot of fun with it. But the Ming Dynasty, looking forward, the Ming will fall eventually in 1644, but that certainly will not be in this time period. As Mr. Beckman said, China's a really big deal. Yeah, we're going to be covering, I think we're going to need some more videos on China. Certainly we will be providing them and reviewing them over and over again this year. But the Ming Dynasty eventually falls in 1644, and it falls to another kind of outside force, the Qing Dynasty, the Manchu, which is a non-Chinese group that comes in and dominates China. And so the Qing Dynasty will be the last ruling dynasty of China, and it will last from 1644 to 1911. And so that's going to be kind of the last one that would be covered. So in your course, you're going to be spending a lot of time with the Ming and Qing dynasties before you get to the 20th century and the Republic of China, and then the People's Republic of China with the rise of communism. And for much of that time period, there are going to be, as I kind of state here, European eyes on China. Europeans will eventually arrive in China and trade with them and bring European culture and want access to Chinese culture. It is important to understand that Europeans don't just come in and dominate China. They don't just come in and we have gunboats and we're going to take over and do whatever we want. In fact, China under the Ming Dynasty remains quite powerful. And under the Ming and Qing, they limit European trade to just one little place, Canton, in the Canton system. And so China remains quite a powerful player in trade, although they perhaps are not seeking out European goods. One of the things that's going to have China trading a lot more with Europe is that they value silver. And in the Americas, there is going to be a great deal of silver discovered and will become a global currency, which will certainly allow Europeans will use that currency to pay for a great deal of Chinese goods. The image I've chosen here is of Jesuit priests in China, and just kind of that idea of European culture arriving in China. Although you can see here that it is Chinese culture and cultural even dress that really dominates this image, which I think shows that balance of power for some time. It's not going to be until the 1800s when Britain, through the Opium Wars, really goes and begins to dominate in China and impose its will. So that's a long way off in the course, long way off. So that's looking way far forward. But just so you kind of can set this in a grand overview of what is happening. So that is China in the global Middle Ages. Maybe more than you bargained for, but we got to look at a few really good sources. Thank you to Mr. Beckman for that idea and actually putting the first one in there with that image of Kublai Khan hunting is just one of the absolute best images. As he says, China's a big deal. We have a Mongol review coming in a couple of weeks. I don't know who's going to be running that one, but man, that's heavy is the head that wears that crown, man. That's a big responsibility. The only question that we have unanswered here is, so I'm going to go ahead and take a look at it. Who are the Red Turbans? So this is in reference to the Red Turban rebellion in China. And it's kind of, this might be more information than you need to know, but the Red Turban Rebellion is a name given for an uprising in China between about 1350 to 1368 that leads to the downfall of the Mongols and eventually leading to their overthrow. But it's influenced by a group called like the White Lotus, this kind of organization called the White Lotus. And it's kind of caused by a number of things, especially some problems that are seen in China, natural disasters, flooding, maybe some economic troubles that come with considerable military spending. There's also, I think, the Black Death plays a role in causing some general catastrophes. And with those deaths led to the decline of agriculture. And so there's kind of a lot of disasters going on. And when there are these periods of disaster, of struggle, then what we end up seeing are people get very upset and they look for answers. And they, of course, look for answers in their government. And in this sense, it was a foreign Mongol government that they then fought against, eventually weakening them and then leading to the overthrow and the rise of the Ming. So I'm sorry that I didn't cover that very closely earlier on, but I'm glad I got to look at it. So as Mr. Beckman says here in the chat, remember that if there's anything in this that you want to go back and look at, replays are available for Fiveable Plus members. So definitely consider joining that. You can always go back and look at these to help study, or go look at specific parts in videos that you might need a little bit more on. Thank you for participating in this, everybody. Tanya, Ilsa, and Lucia, and I hope I'm saying everybody's names right. Alexandra and Ellie, Leah, and man, there were just a lot of people. And of course, Eric himself coming in here. So really great to have you in here, and hope that you have a wonderful evening. Get some rest. If you're out there on that West Coast, consider taking a look at tonight's video or stream on themes, because it'll be a good one. Y'all have a great day, and we will see you soon.